Apologies for the logistical difficulties, people. Everybody online, this is the first webinar of the year, and reflexes are a bit rusty. So about that, Lisanne, could you just back up a little bit and start us over from the beginning of the COSO Cube?
Absolutely, no problem. So let's see. All right. So again, we talked about enterprise risk management being something that's complex and something that can be daunting. And one of the tenets that I use to try to describe my approach to this is that if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. But ERM has suffered from a lot of complexity, starting first of all with the COSO Cube, which was issued in 2004, which includes a lot of content and one visual. But just looking at the graphic, it's difficult to figure out how to actually implement it. In response, Australia and New Zealand came out with their own standard, which showed kind of the circulatory nature of communication and ongoing monitoring with the risk identification and prioritization process. And then as a building off of that Australia-New Zealand standard came the ISO 31000 standard, which had to be included in not one, but two visuals. One that kind of talked about the overall governance structure, and then another one that talked about the process to use to identify risks and prioritize them, etc. And so there's a lot of stuff going on in enterprise risk management. And as we work with folks and as they work to implement ERM, one of the things we kept running into is that people at the top levels of the organization understood the value of ERM. They understood the value of kind of breaking down those silos. But it was hard to get it to relate to people at the desk level, at the individual level, how enterprise risk management impacts them directly. And part of that is also with these narrative descriptions. So this is the first narrative description of enterprise risk management for the COSO framework. And it's a whole paragraph. I can usually get through it in one breath when I'm not fighting a cold. But there's a lot of jargon here. There's a lot of content. There's things like risk appetite and reasonable assurance and all types of things out there, right? And so there's been a couple efforts at simplifying the definition of enterprise risk management to try to make it more relevant. So the Institute of Internal Auditors of the UK and Ireland came up with this definition, which is a structured, consistent, and continuous process across the whole organization for identifying, assessing, deciding on responses to, and reporting on opportunities and threats that affect the achievement of its objectives. And so I like this definition because it uses a lot of plain words. It does include identifying both opportunities and threats, so identifying that upside of risk as well as the downside of risks, and that it's a continuous process that takes place across the organization. So this definition has a lot going for it, but it's still not quite there yet for people that are not necessarily risk professionals. The IIA Research Foundation wrote a white paper on comparing and contrasting governance, risk, and compliance and enterprise risk management. It's a really great paper. It was one of the best $25 I've spent in a long time. And their overall definition was that ERM is an integrated, systematic process of identifying major risks to achieving the specific goals and objectives of the organization. These risks should be analyzed by likelihood and impact and mitigated to an acceptable level of risk. One of the things that I liked about this definition is that it really focuses on major risk, not all risk. And it's those major risks related to the specific goals and objectives of the organization. And then it talks about what you should do to analyze those risks. So if Einstein were still around today and we were to ask him for his explanation, I think that he would simplify it in this way. The ERM is a process that helps manage diverse organizational risks and supports the successful achievement of objectives. Right? Very simple, very straightforward, but covers all the bases. But that doesn't necessarily cover the how to implement enterprise risk management. So if we take that COSO Cube and we kind of boil it down to its lowest level of detail, right? So you'll see that at the bottom it has the 8 different layers of the COSO Cube kind of broken down into a process. So you start with your internal environment. So your internal environment is basically the culture of your organization. It's your mission and goals. The objective setting is the specific goals that you are implementing in order to achieve that overall mission. As part of that, you identify and prioritize your risks, figure out what are all your different options to manage those risks, in the risk response column. And then when you figure out what your control activities are, which out of all those options, which ones are you going to implement, and then how are you going to measure performance on an ongoing basis? So when you take that COSO Cube and you boil it down to the steps and communicate them in plain English, it then becomes a little bit more relatable to folks that aren't necessarily risk professionals. And a lot of folks will look at this and say, well, yeah, that's what I do already, which is great. The challenge is that not everybody approaches things in the same way, and that's one of the benefits of enterprise risk management, is it gives people a consistent toolbox and a consistent approach to be able to identify and prioritize risks in relation to their objectives. And so if we're going to take these simple steps and translate them to the desk level, what we're calling tactical enterprise risk management, let's go through and see how those work in the various steps. So when you're looking at enterprise risk management from a tactical level, you still have to have an understanding of what is the mission and purpose of your organization. So if you're a Peet's Coffee or Starbucks Coffee, you may have different priorities and goals and culture than a nonprofit does, than a university does, than a state or government agency does. So you still have to have an understanding of what the overall purpose of your organization is and what your role is in supporting that mission, right? So if you're a university, you could be a budget officer, you could be an administrator, you could be a researcher, you could be an internal auditor. And all those different diverse roles play a different part in achieving the mission of the university. So having an understanding of what your role is helps ground you in what your best purpose is for the organization. So now that you understand what your role is in the organization and helping to achieve the goals and priorities and the strategic plan of the organization, then you need to figure out, what are you trying to accomplish? So are you trying to, if you're that coffee business that I talked about, I'm going to talk a little bit about coffee because everybody understands it, and we could all use an extra cup of joe here and there. And I used to work at Peet's when I was in college, so I'm slightly biased, but I've been known to frequent a Starbucks once in a while as well. So if you're a coffee business, you're generally trying to grow your market share. You're trying to make sure that you are maintaining your quality levels for your customers. You're trying to make sure that you can compete with new and emerging products and services and other competitors in the market. So you always have to be mindful of what you're trying to accomplish. But you also need to figure out, well, I don't want to just get bigger market share. You need to define what that success looks like. And that's going to play a key role in being able to measure progress against that success over time when we get to the end of the framework. So first you need to really define what that success looks like and how does that goal support the organization's mission. If you can't tie your objectives of what you're trying to accomplish and to what your overall organization is trying to accomplish, you might be going in different directions, and that can result in waste, in failed initiatives, and in rework and lost productivity. So there's a lot of reasons that you want to make sure that you're in alignment with the organizational objectives, but still being mindful of what your specific role is and being able to own that perspective. So once you've figured out what you're trying to accomplish and you've defined what that success looks like and how it supports the overall goals of the organization, then you need to figure out, what are all those things that could get in the way of you being able to achieve that goal. So we think about things as realities and barriers, but they can also be challenges and opportunities at the same time. Risk has two sides, right? So risk is consequence, but also opportunity. It's uncertainty on those objectives. But we really want to have an understanding of what are all the different things that could impair our ability to achieve our specific goals, right? So does your organization have technology challenges? Do you have multiple siloed systems that don't talk to each other? Do you have legacy systems that are becoming difficult to maintain? Do you rely on external vendors to get your data feeds? What's your regulatory environment like? Do you have new regulations coming towards you that may impact what you're trying to do? So for example, airports are looking at potentially the FAA having to mandate that they adopt safety a safety management system to help with the screening of passengers and the management of airport risks, which is kind of like implementing an enterprise risk management program for airports. But that's something that you need to be mindful of, and you can use an ERM approach to be able to help adapt to those changing regulatory environments. Fiscal and resource constraints are going to be a constant no matter what type of organization you're a part of. The time and money are not unlimited resources. We just need to make sure that we're allocating them in the best way possible. And that can happen not only on an enterprise-wide basis, but also on an individual basis. If you're responsible for a budget or a department, or even if you're just responsible for yourself, you need to make sure that you are managing your time in a way that assures that you're focusing on the most important activities. So event identification can be all those different things that can get in your way. So once you've identified all those different things that can impair your ability to achieve your objective, then you need to figure out what needs to be addressed immediately, what needs to be addressed soon, what needs to be addressed later, or what needs to be addressed never, what you can just accept. And so for those of you that are familiar with enterprise risk management, a lot of times we use terms like impact and likelihood for your risks, assessing the effectiveness of your controls on a scale of 1 to 5. But the way that we're communicating this at the tactical level is just basically an organic prioritization based on what has to be addressed immediately, what can happen after that, what would be a nice to have, and then if it's not one of those three things, do you really need to spend your limited time doing it? And so the first step is to identify what are those things that you cannot be successful without addressing. Identify those things that if you do them, they can enhance the value, the relevance, or the sustainability of the project that you're engaging in, and the ones that are nice to have but are ultimately not essential. So if you go through that process, you basically have a prioritization of your risks. So once you've figured out all those different options, you need to select the best solution within your constraints. So what is the best and most efficient way to overcome these challenges? We work with a lot of clients where they're trying to implement ERM at a organization-wide level. And they start with saying, well, we want to implement a system. A lot of times that's not necessarily the best way, because a lot of times if you implement a system without looking at the underlying process, you could just be automating a bad process and things will just happen faster and create a record. So you want to have an understanding of what is practical. Sometimes you don't need a fancy dashboard business intelligence system. Sometimes all you need is a spreadsheet, or sometimes all you need is to implement a meeting where people can talk about things on a frequent basis and implement the process component and having that conversation to be able to facilitate communication. So the second bullet says, be mindful of the strength and sustainability of your mitigation strategy. So not all controls are created equal, right? So if you find that a lot of the controls that you're implementing in order to support the successful achievement of your objective is training, keep in mind that training, although essential, is very difficult to keep sustainable, that it's perishable, and it's often the first thing that gets cut when people have busy schedules. So the things that you want to really look at implementing are the things that will get you lasting value out of your efforts. And a lot of times those are a little bit more difficult to implement, but they're more sustainable over time. But having a better understanding of what the risks are before you try to implement your controls helps you select the right control mix for you. So up into this part, that's pretty much the standard enterprise risk management workflow, right? But the information communication, the monitoring part, are the parts that make enterprise risk management more enterprising in nature, whether you're applying it at an organization-wide level or at the tactical level. So even if I'm a budget officer and I'm changing the way that we are implementing forms, I still need to have an understanding of how I'm going to help people accept this change. How am I going to get them to participate in a new process? There's a lot of ways to do that. The first one is to really involve others in the process, have an understanding of how it impacts their desk in addition to what you're trying to accomplish, making sure that those conversations are happening. Communicating early and often. I've heard a lot of change management presentations where it's almost you can't communicate enough. And the earlier that you can create awareness and facilitate a desire for actually adopting that change across the organization before they even experience the change, the more successful your initiatives can be. In addition, facilitating increased information communication can help you manage expectations because you've already started throughout the process saying this is what we're trying to accomplish and this is how it supports the mission of the organization. These are the risks. These are our constraints. This is the best control that we can implement given these constraints. And so we may still have some residual risk. They may not actually use those words to describe the process, but ultimately the process of doing that is to manage expectations, and it strengthens your business case if you do have to request additional resources, additional funding, additional staff to be able to support your initiative, or even if you just need management buy-in, it really does strengthen your case. Last but not least, and step number 7 for tactical enterprise risk management is how do you measure success? You really need to be able to collect information needed to measure that progress over time. So it helps to have a good understanding of what your goals are at the outset so you can collect those variables as you work through. So for example, Bickmore assisted the University of California with portions of the WorkStrong program and looking at early intervention and how that can provide value and how it can reduce our overall workers' compensation costs. And so we knew that we would need to track specific variables in order to measure that success. So during the project implementation, we said we need to make sure that we are collecting these pieces of information in the claim system, and we worked closely with Cedric to be able to facilitate that so we actually could measure success both before and after the implementation. So it helps to go through this process as you're penciling things out, or my personal preference is sticky notes, to go through and have an understanding of all those different constraints and make sure that you are keeping the end in mind when you're developing your project, and that will help you measure your success on the ongoing basis. But it's one thing to collect that information, and it's another thing to act on that information. And so you have to be able to set parameters in terms of what is meeting your goals, what is not meeting your goals, and what is exceeding. And when you're not meeting your goals, when do you need to know about that, and what are you going to do? Who needs to receive that information? How are they going to manage it? So we just covered the enterprise risk management process at a very at a tactical level. We recognize that this is a siloed level, but overall, whenever you're looking at trying to do something, you just need to ask yourself these questions. First of all, what are you trying to accomplish, and how does it support the mission of the organization? What are the realities and barriers? For those realities and barriers, what needs to be addressed immediately, soon, later, or never? And what is the best, most efficient way to overcome this challenge, knowing that you might not always be able to get everything, the specific thing that you want, but having an understanding of what your needs and what your bare necessities are, that can help you select what is the most efficient and practical approach for managing those risks. How do you prepare people to accept this change? And then how do you measure success on an ongoing basis? So you're probably asking yourselves, how do you actually scale this up to enterprise-wide risk management, right? So it's very, you could see how you can apply it using plain language, but that's just one part of it. You could see how you can implement it into the day-to-day decision-making process, but that's also just a part of it. But we all know that the purpose of enterprise risk management is to break down those silos and gain enhanced insight into objectives and risks across the organization. But sometimes you have to work from the bottom at the same time you're working from the top. And so I think that we all know that the last week in January is generally the week that a lot of New Year's resolutions go to die, right? But I want to use this time to emphasize that changing the way that you approach things doesn't have to be that way. You don't have to set that 25-pound goal and then try to lose it all at once. Sometimes you just have to lose it a pound at a time. And tactical enterprise risk management doesn't necessarily give you that enterprise-wide view of risks, but by enabling people at all levels of the organization to apply ERM concepts you can still improve risk awareness and support better decision making. Building an awareness and a competency for enterprise risk management at different levels of the organization can actually facilitate the adoption of your enterprise-wide risk management efforts, because they can understand the relevance to them and their work directly and understand what the scale is to move it up to the organization-wide level. So just getting into some of the benefits, which we talked about, just trying to refresh on those, that enterprise risk management, that using a tactical ERM approach that builds on the activities that people are already doing but encourages a little bit more consistency in how they approach that, fosters better ERM competency at all levels of the organization. You're still using all the same brain cells in the process, just with a different scope. This also helps make ERM principles relevant to individuals, and it makes them more open to supporting organization-wide ERM adoption, because they could see how it benefits them in developing their risk awareness and improving the success of their decision making, that they could see how it fits into the overall bigger picture. So it makes it much more understandable and relevant, even though they understand that it's not necessarily effort neutral. It's not going to be always the easiest thing that you do. But by providing a little bit of consistency and using plain language and relating it to what people are already doing, that can actually, using a tactical ERM approach, can facilitate and strengthen your enterprise-wide risk efforts. So with that, I'm going to open up the floor for questions or comments.
As mentioned, the phone lines are open, so please feel free to speak up if you have any questions. And of course, if any questions occur to you later on, feel free to send an email to erm@ucop.edu, and our ERM service desk will be happy to relay it to Lisanne. So, since it sounds like we don't have any questions, thank you so much, Lisanne. That was a great presentation. We hope to see you for the future Toolbox webinars. And just a quick teaser for next month, we are looking at topics in construction and ways of dealing with risk in an enterprise-wide manner. So thank you, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.